My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
Ribs. Beef pork ribs. That was as far as that joke could go, but I like it still.
Well, Beef Pork Ribs, it's good to have you back once again after I'm assuming you're on some secret mission.
I could tell you, but then you would know. I'm not going to actually talk like Sean Connery for the whole episode, much as I would love to do that.
Ben the Movie Buff, you're also back with us this week.
Yes, hey, how are you? It was weird last Sunday not hanging out with you guys, but something else, a secret mission came up, but I'm back. I have a few days off before my next secret mission, so happy to be here to talk about 007.
Indeed. So last week on the show, I pulled ranking the Bond actors out of the Bat Jar. So that is why we're here today to talk about James Bond, 007, that whole kit and caboodle. I believe this is actually the first time we've really spoken in depth about James Bond on the podcast. So it means we have to do our secret origin segment, our SOS, to find out how each of us were introduced to the 007 franchise. And Beef Pork Ribs, I know you are a big Bond fan, so let's hear from you first.
Man, where did it start? I think, honestly, it's just the first Bond movie I saw was Dr. No, and it was because my dad showed it to me. So I think that's kind of how it started. We didn't have any of the James Bond movies when I was growing up, but my dad liked them a lot. My mom, not so much. And so at some point, I think it was like we went to the video rental store that I mentioned in our Scooby-Doo episode, Flicks and Flavors, and Dad rented one of the James Bond movies, and only me and my older sister got to see it because the other kids were too young. And that was kind of my introduction. And the next James Bond movie I saw was the silly Casino Royale one, which the whole family watched because it was a lot funnier and we're a little bit older. So some of the questionable 60s things in it were slightly better received. And then I got to university and started watching movies on my own, and I started collecting the James Bond movies chronologically, but also I may have slightly illegally watched all of them over the course of a month at some point when I was in university. And that kind of cemented me liking them. I think I may have seen some of the Pierce Brosnan's ones in between. Also, I'm going to butcher his name all the time because he, along with Sean Connery and David Niven, were the only Bonds I knew when my mastery of the English language wasn't quite what it is today. So I tend to mispronounce his name. Something I say Bronsman, something I say Brosnan. I forget which one is the right one, to be honest. But yeah, just always liked the movies, and the more I got into movies, the more I can enjoy the James Bond movies because they are in a lot of ways like a snippet of the time those movies were made. I remember watching a video recently that was like talking about how martial arts evolved in movies before and after The Green Hornet and Bruce Lee, and the example they chose were the two James Bond movies before and after, and how dramatically different the fight scenes were in those two movies. So it's really good to have those movies that are almost like time capsules, even though they follow very similar formulas, and that allow you to kind of see what movies were like, but also kind of culturally what we were like at that point, which I think is one of the strong points of the series.
I think I would have been about 16, maybe 17 years old when Casino Royale had come out, Daniel Craig's first outing as James Bond. I had not seen any of the James Bond movies before Casino Royale. I remember a friend of mine at the time, um, we were going to the theaters, and she kind of had a mild interest in seeing Casino Royale. So I thought to myself, sure, why not? I love movies, so let's go see my first James Bond movie. And let's just say I was a different person by the time that movie had ended, because Casino Royale, and this might be a bit of a spoiler alert for our discussion later, but Casino Royale is still one of my favorite movies of all time. It's my favorite Bond film. It's one of my favorite action movies of all time. I love this movie so much that after that, I would then go to Videoflix, the video rental store, about 10 minutes away from my place, and there was a deal where you could get 5 movies and pay a little less for each movie, right? You're renting them in bulk, so you're getting a deal. So I would get the Bond movies, as many as were at the store. I would get them in batches of 5, watch the 5 Bond movies, and then go back and then get another batch of 5 Bond movies to watch them all. So I have seen every single official Bond film. I've seen one of the 2 unofficial Bond films. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Bond movies, and I was devastated when No Time to Die had to get pushed earlier this year. So I am very much looking forward to it.
I think actually my first exposure to 007 was the GoldenEye video game for the N64. I don't think I'd seen a single James Bond movie before that or had heard of the character. So everyone who's like from our age demographic would remember GoldenEye on the N64 because it was just like the, I guess, the fun first person kind of shooter video game where you literally all you see is the gun in front of you and your screen would bleed when you died. It was like the thing to do with your friends was play GoldenEye. So I think that was my first exposure to James Bond as a franchise. And if I'm being totally honest, I think I saw the Austin Powers movies before I ever actually saw a James Bond movie all the way through. And so, for those who don't know, Austin Powers is a movie series that essentially is a parody of James Bond and this whole spy genre. So it takes everything that is kind of maybe cliche or a stereotype in James Bond and like takes it to the 11th degree of kind of ridiculousness. So by the time I had actually watched a 007 film, I had already watched Austin Powers, and so to me it just seemed like a less silly version of Austin Powers. But since then, I have seen several different James Bond movies. I have not seen them all. As you guys, as we get into this conversation more, you're going to see I'm the most ignorant on this topic. I know the least about James Bond, and so it'd be really interesting to hear what you guys have to say as we start talking more about the character.
I am going to say that that was probably my first knowledge of James Bond was also GoldenEye. But funny enough, I did not watch Austin Powers until I think you showed it to me when we lived together, and that was the first time I watched it. I'm still not sure how I feel about it, but it's definitely James Bond-esque. I do remember very distinctly a kind of interesting thing that when we were young, my dad did keep mentioning whenever we watched Chitty Chitty Bang Bang how similar it was to James Bond because as it turns out, it was also written by Ian Fleming and it does have a lot of similarities. Only I didn't notice until much later that even the villain in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was a Bond villain. It was the Baron, was played by the same actor who played Goldfinger, which I thought was hilarious.
And to wrap up our SOS, just some secret origin stuff for the actual Bond franchise. People may not know that James Bond originated in a novel series by author Sir Ian Fleming. The first book, Casino Royale, was published in 1953, and before Ian Fleming's death in 1964, he had written 12 novels and 2 short story collections featuring James Bond as a character. And since his death, several other authors have written stories about James Bond, the most recent being written in 2018. And James Bond has been a movie series since 1962. The first film that was made was called Doctor No. So it's a franchise that's been going on for quite a while at this point, and as we get into ranking the different actors, we'll get into how the series has progressed. So this has been our Secret Origin segment for 007. Today's episode is something that we've done before for several different characters. We've done rankings for actors who've played Batman, Spider-Man, the Joker. So if you've listened to any of those episodes before, you kind of know what's coming here. We're essentially going to go through the actors through the official Batjar system, through our official ranking system. And we try to collect as many different inputs as possible when kind of making an official ranking of something. And it basically means involving as many different opinions as possible so that's a diverse collection of thoughts. But before we actually get into ranking the James Bond actors, we should probably get into just a bit about who the character of James Bond is and how these different actors relate to each other. So, my first question for you guys, over the course of the movie series, there have been 6 official actors who have been James Bond. Now, every time the role has been recast, is the idea that they're playing the same character, and it's like the Batman movies that were made in the 80s and 90s where the actor swapping it was meant to be playing the same character, or is it meant to be a reboot of some kind?
So it's funny you bring that up because I, for the longest time, especially as I was watching the movies as a teenager, I believed that, yeah, it was basically recasting the role, but it's still the exact same person. And I suppose, I mean, we have, geez, 23, 24 Bond movies now that I think there could be arguments for both. But I do kind of like the theory that um, that 007, that James Bond could be like a code name, right? And that various people could kind of fill into that role because, yeah, I feel like there are lots of Bond movies, and you can tell. I think, as someone was mentioning earlier, that a lot of them are kind of a product of their time, right? The 60s Bond movies have differences from the 70s Bond movies and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and all that. So I kind of like the idea that it could possibly be a different person, just assuming the name.
It's an interesting thing because the Daniel Craig movies kind of screwed the pooch in some ways. Because, well, specifically Skyfall, because it suddenly had this idea that James Bond was, in fact, called James Bond and always had been, and had kind of a backstory that went back to his childhood, more or less. You can still make the arguments, and a lot of people have made it, that it's still a code name, but also, what is interesting is that um, there's been like a change in how that works because in the older movies, and specifically when Sean Connery stopped being James Bond for a movie and then started again, uh, they acted, and the way the plot moved forward was very much as James Bond being the same person. Also, to note is that a lot of the other characters didn't change their actors, and actually, um, the actor for Q remained the same guy from the first movie up until the second last Pierce Brosnan movie. So because of that, it was kind of assumed they were the same people. As they got further, like there are like distinctive things in, I believe, Diamond Are Forever, that are direct effects of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Even though the two Bonds were different people, the events that happened to one of them uh, remained and lingered on into the first movie that Roger Moore did. I can't remember which one it is, but Spectre and Blofeld and everything that had to do with James Bond's wife was still happening in those movies, which kind of implied it was the same man, just played by different actors. But then later on, as Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan came in, it became a lot more accepted to be, no, it's just kind of a code name, something that the weird one-off 1967 movie kind of had, is that, oh, we're just calling everybody James Bond. But that kind of became the main theory. And then once again, when the Daniel Craig movies came out, it kind of was still looking at that, but then also had more, again, it went more into like the childhood backstory of James Bond that might have been saying that he was James Bond from the beginning. So it's kind of fluctuated a little bit, but I agree with Ben that my preferred theory is that 007 is always James Bond, no matter who actually is, like, who has the title of 007 agent. He will always be called James Bond no matter who it is, and it's a code name, which also explains why he so brazenly gives his name.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the series as a whole is that I think because you have so many different movies, like you mentioned, um, Diamonds Are Forever kind of deals with some things on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then also the Daniel Craig movies like Quantum of Solace is a direct sequel to Casino Royale. Skyfall kind of deals with James Bond's origins as a child. Even Spectre kind of finds a way to try and bring all of the Daniel Craig Bond films together. So it's interesting how some of these movies are kind of interested in referencing other Bond movies, and I feel like a lot of them are kind of just here's a singular adventure with James Bond, right? And we're not going to have James Bond like bring up all these um, references and memories of things that have happened in the past, although I'm sure that occasionally happens. But it's interesting how some Bond movies try to reach out to other Bond films, and some are just doing their own thing.
And I think it's important for us to get this kind of settled because as if we're going to be ranking these different actors who have played the role of James Bond, to emphasize if they're not playing the same character, that will kind of play into our feelings and possibly how others feel about these different characters as well. Because I think Doctor Who created the perfect loophole for recasting where they make it, they say that he's this alien that kind of like essentially changes his physical form and his personality every so often. So you could have the different actors stepping into the role and doing something different with it, but then it's still air quotes the same character. With 007 it seems to be the same thing. Different actors come into the part and they don't play it exactly the same as the person who was there before. They kind of do their own thing and bring out different elements of the character that different audiences seem to appeal, or appeals to different audiences.
The one thing I will say about that, and I'm going to say it because it did affect the way I rated them, is that they are still based on the same character. Like all the James, they're still based on the Ian Fleming's James Bond, and some of the, especially like some of the movies, are directly based on the books. And so I've always taken that kind of into consideration, that even though they may have evolved, they should still be James Bond. Whereas the Doctor does completely change his personality and everything. I always felt that on some levels the actors were trying to be Ian Fleming's James Bond, and even for many of the movies it was like Ian Fleming's Doctor No. Like it wasn't known as a James Bond movie necessarily right off the bat. It was a lot more about recognizing the author and what he'd created, and so even though they definitely are different, and like for example when Pierce Brosnan starts as James Bond, there's a all the conflict about like how spying isn't happening like it used to during the Cold War, something that's kept going through with Daniel Craig's movies. It's still, there was still this aspect of the character, the core character, that remained and wasn't really different from one movie to another. And I've taken that kind of that approach, that they are still all based on the same character, whereas Doctor Who, like other than certain doctors trying to imitate previous ones, it really isn't based on one singular character, and they very much made the separation. Whereas again, with James Bond, it's a lot more ambiguous, and there isn't a straight answer as to whether that is they are the same person or different people taking on the same mantle. Uh, but regardless, I did my ranking based on taking on the mantle, but respecting kind of where that mantle and influence came from.
And also, just to get this out there before we start going through the ranking, it'd be helpful for us to just very briefly kind of touch upon who James Bond is, like what the kind of ideal version of the character is, and that'll help us kind of differentiate the different portrayals. So again, you guys will probably be more concise and more detailed in how you answer this, but to how I understand James Bond is he is like the archetype of what a spy is. Like the whole idea of a spy movie, you first of all think of James Bond. He is this essentially a secret agent who is not only good at fighting and essentially I guess you would call it detective work or police work or but he's got a good poker face. He's good at essentially pretending to be somebody else and infiltration, and he's very good at kind of interrogating people and perhaps not necessarily physically, but charismatically getting information out of them. He's very good at getting women to express interest in him romantically, get information out of them, and he's kind of like a one man army. He knows exactly what his goal is. He's given his mission, and he goes out and completes it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. I think I have the first novel, Casino Royale, that Ian Fleming wrote, and there was a quote on the back that I feel like kind of summed up Bond well, where they said something along the lines of, all the women want to be with Bond and all the men want to be Bond. And I think, yeah, like you say, he is kind of an archetype. Like even though maybe James Bond doesn't have exactly the best morals, like we see that he clearly knows how to get the job done, even if he's flawed. He is cool. He is a classy gentleman. There are a lot of things to like about him. And I think yeah, I think certain movies will kind of show that he is not perfect, but even be that as it may, like he still will achieve his goal.
I think like generally it's um the idea of James Bond is he has all the outwardly appearance of being a perfect gentleman, but he has all the skills and ruthlessness to get things like Ben the movie buff said to get things done. Um, which mostly skills in like deceiving people, gathering information. He's a near perfect shot, and he's got a near perfect poker face.
So for this ranking, I have included all three of our individual rankings. I've included according to the website, the definitive ranking of James Bond actors from a website called Gentleman's Journal. And I've also included the ranking from a YouTuber called Dutch Bond Fan. He was kind of like the first one that popped up when I went searching in YouTube. So there are 5 different sources of ranking. There are 6 Bond actors. We're only going to count the ones that are officially in the official Bond movies. There's ones that have there was one guy who played James Bond in like a TV movie in the 50s. That was an adaptation of Casino Royale. There's the other kind of unofficial movies that have been touched upon here. So just to keep it simple, we're going to focus on the 6 actors who have been in the official Bond movies. Because there are 6 actors and 5 rankers, the absolute highest score actor could get here is 30 points. It's like golf. The lower your score is, the better you've done. So we're going to go through them from worst to best, and we're going to talk about why they are where they are in the rankings. So, without any further ado, in 6th place with 29 points. So remember, the worst score you can get is 30. So this guy has 29 points. That pretty much puts him near the bottom. Is George Lazenby, who played 007 once in 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Good morning. My name's Bond. James Bond.
Interestingly enough, the official 007 website has little bios about each of the actors who've played James Bond. So I'm just going to quote this very briefly for each of them. It says that he was born in Australia and was one of the highest paid models working in Europe before he was spotted by producer Cubby Broccoli in the barbers at Dorchester Hotel. His physical exuberance and energy secured Lazenby the role of Bond, but a long-term commitment to 007 never materialized. Lazenby departed the series after just one memorable performance. So I think because indeed he was only in one movie, we kind of have the least to go off of for him. I haven't even seen this film, so I haven't. I just put him at the bottom because I knew nothing about him.
I feel like a lot of people did that because I honestly quite enjoyed On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I find that I don't remember. I don't think I ranked him above Roger Moore in my ranking, but I had thought about it because um, I thought he did very well. Like he clearly is a very good-looking man, and I like Yeah, I almost put him above Roger Moore. I didn't because I feel like the problem is Roger Moore had a lot of bad movies, probably some of the worst. But I just thought, since there is only On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which also has like the kind of weird, heavy plot point of James Bond getting married, which was very strange. It's kind of unfortunate that he doesn't get more recognition because he was only in one movie. That being said, I'll talk about another one that I think more strongly, but I still think that On Her Majesty's Secret Service was a perfectly good James Bond film, and that his performance made him a good Bond. It's unfortunate that we only have that to go on, but I still think, to me, he doesn't deserve to be last. But I have a very biased opinion on that place.
So I'll be honest, it's been like years since I've seen On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I remember liking it fine when I saw it. But for this list, or at least for my personal list, I was rewatching a whole bunch of clips of the various Bond actors. And when I was revisiting On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the few scenes that I was watching, maybe they weren't the best scenes to judge, but I did find that anytime he delivered his lines, there was something about it that I didn't find he was as cool as the other Bonds, right? I think that is something that we kind of look for in each Bond is and I mean, I know it's probably not the best way to describe it, but like, how cool is he, right? When he says things, the way he acts, do we think like, oh man, I want to be like that guy? And I feel like George Lazenby, with the few scenes I was watching, I just felt a little kind of flattered. It's like he wasn't doing a horrible job, but I feel like I've seen other Bond actors do much better. And true, he's only in one movie, but at least on the bright side, this isn't some quick 90-minute movie. Like the movie's almost 2.5 hours long. So I like to think that's still a pretty decent vehicle to show off what you can do with a performance in that time.
Yeah, I mean, since I haven't seen this movie, is it fair to say that because he was a model that maybe he might have looked the part, but the acting chops weren't quite there?
I don't know if I'd go quite that far, although it is telling that he's the only non uh, British actor who played the role, which that might have had something to do with it, that he did have to put on more of an accent than the other ones did. uh, because I think, whether we like it or not, subconsciously we think of the British accent as being sophisticated and probably associate James Bond with it a bit more. That might be part of it. But also, I don't know. It was definitely a more romantic, like actual romance, rather than just finding a girl and using her for information, that there was, which also kind of diminished the cool factor, probably, like in the sense that James Bond usually is super action packed, and if he does develop feeling for a girl, she usually ends up dead, or he ends up drinking those feelings away, which didn't really happen in this movie. So maybe that has to do with it as well.
And that brings us to fifth place with 23 points. We have Timothy Dalton, who played the role twice in 1987 and 1989.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond.
The official 007 website says Timothy Dalton is remembered as the actor who channeled the more ruthless, hard edged James Bond found in Ian Fleming's original novels. Born in Wales in, I won't say his birth year, Dalton trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and his stage work quickly marked him out as an actor of tremendous presence. Initially approached to play Bond in 1968, which he declined because he was just 25 years old at the time, Dalton finally slipped into the tuxedo in 1987 and became the fourth actor in the series, starring in two films that offered a darker, conflicted, but no less seductive 007.
This is the one that kind of upset me that it's lower down the list, because I mean, I like Timothy Dalton as an actor, and I like him a lot as James Bond, and I think that kind of we that description did talk about how he was a bit more the ruthless side. I will say though, I feel like there might have been a part of it that people weren't quite ready for it yet, because I don't know, he does offer kind of a transition from the slightly more calm demeanor of James Bond into what became a bit more of an action hero type of figure. Um, but also, I mean, he was following Roger Moore, who was probably the least action-oriented Bond of all of them. And so maybe I feel like maybe it was too much of a change all at once, from what people were used to. But I think, I mean, Timothy Dalton's, like they talked about his presence. His presence was great. He was, he was a a strong presence on the screen. He was definitely, I would rank him as much, if we're talking about like the cool people want to be him, way above Roger Moore and possibly even above some other Bonds that I might have put higher than him on my list personally. But I think I'm actually really sad he was only in two movies. I think he deserved more than that because I think he was an absolutely spectacular Bond.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, Beat Porfibs. I like the two Bond movies that he was in just fine. For my ranking, I did put him in second last place, and I mean it's nothing like personal against him, but I think see it's interesting. It's like you said earlier how in some of the earlier Roger Moore movies, I think someone in support of this theory of James Bond being a code name, they did kind of bring up the fact that I think they said, "Oh, in one of the '80s Roger Moore movies, he is in a clown costume," and I think it's the only movie where James Bond is in a clown costume. But then after the Roger Moore era, we get to Timothy Dalton, and yeah, I think it might have been too dark too soon to have a James Bond that was, I guess, as angry, as ruthless as Timothy Dalton was. I still think he does a pretty good job. I just found myself liking the other Bond actors better. But I will say that, yeah, Timothy Dalton still did the best he could with the two movies that he was in.
Yeah, I find it interesting that he was approached in 1968. That basically meant that they wanted him instead of George Lazenby for the one movie that he did. So it's interesting that he was approached so young, so early on in his career to be Bond, and it took him so long to actually get in there. It also makes me think how Beef Pork Rib said like these different Bond movies kind of like illustrate what movies were like at the time. And so when Timothy Dalton's Bond movies are coming out, it's the late '80s. We started to see more kind of like hardcore and action hero oriented movies where the heroes were more intense and they weren't necessarily churning out as many one liners when they were doing their stuff. So it's I understand based on what the website says that it's a more faithful adaptation of the character from the book, but perhaps it was also just evocative of that time.
The other thing I remember I was jokingly saying that if you wanted to rank the Bond actors, you rank them by their height, which after a little research it isn't that far off. But I think that was one of the things about Timothy Dalton also, that he is a physically imposing guy, and he was kind of, not just a presence, but like physically he looked a lot more like somebody who would be able to beat up people than I think almost any of the other ones did. Just and it might have been the way he was portrayed or the way it worked, and because again, movie fights were getting a lot better in the 80s and 90s. But I think that that's something else that I think, to me, like, he looks the most like what I imagine James Bond. I've read a few of the James Bond novels, and I think he definitely represents more closely, like physically, what I imagine James Bond to be like as well.
So Timothy, you did the best you could with the time you had. Maybe if you'd gotten into the Bond game earlier, we'd feel differently about you, but for now you're in fifth place. And in fourth place with 20 points, we have Sir Roger Moore, who I believe has the most Bond films under his belt because it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 movies.
Well, actually, Captain, I'm with the British Secret Service. The name is Bond. James Bond.
The website says Roger Moore brought a wit and sense of humor to the role of 007 that were distinctly his own. Born in London, after school, Moore worked in an animation studio working on War Office short films. His artistic ability didn't stop there, and he went on to study at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts before being called up for the military service in 1945. He subsequently appeared in numerous television and stage roles. He was in this. He started in the Saint from 1962 to 1969. He was considered for 007 in 1968 before finally accepting the part in 1972. Moore's good looks, affable presence on set, and sense of timing secured him the leading role in 7 Bond films.
And yes, that is correct. Roger Moore so far has the record for being in the most Bond films. I just want to bring up a quick fun fact because, as you were mentioning, Average Joe, Timothy Dalton was like in his 20s, kind of young to be Bond, but they were clearly offering him the role. What I find kind of interesting is that Sean Connery, I think, was in his early 30s when he started doing the Bond movies, and then after he had done his last one, I think he was in his early to mid 40s. Roger Moore, for his first Bond film, Live and Let Die, he was about 45, 46 when he did his first Bond movie. So it's kind of interesting because they got someone who was a little older than Sean Connery was when he started making Bond movies. And I think that kind of hindered his performance just a little bit in A View to a Kill, his last Bond film, because at that point, like he was in his late 50s being Bond. But overall, I still like Roger Moore. I think, yes, he definitely was a little more witty than some of the other Bonds. And I think overall he did a pretty good job with the 7 Bond movies that he was in. And for me, my favorite performance of his has to be The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. From my understanding, in the books, 007 gets his license to kill when he's 38. And so that's kind of like when the Bond story starts, is he's already in his late 30s. So if they were kind of imagine this idea that these movies are all taking place in the same universe and it's the same character, just swapping out actors, bringing in Roger Moore when they did as an older guy, I guess I could see them aging up the part in a way. And I think I've seen a handful of these movies, but none of them really come to mind. But in researching for this episode, I did come across people talking about him as the fun Bond, the one who had all the really like wacky gadgets and yeah, diffusing a bomb in a clown costume. And I think Beef Pork Ribs kind of talked about how he has some of the worst Bond movies in there, but he's remembered fondly, I guess, because he lasted for so long.
I mean, I think that Moonraker is the absolute worst James Bond movie, and it's his. But it is kind of harder to, for the opposite reasons as Timothy Dalton and George Lazenby. It's kind of hard to really talk about him as objectively because he was in so many of the movies, some good, some bad. I mean, not all of his movies are bad, but I think the other thing is that it's something we talked about when we were talking about Batman, the old Batman show, is that a lot of people picture him when they picture James Bond because he was the Bond that lasted the longest, that was probably at the height of its popularity as well. And so many people kind of associate James Bond with him, but also sadly, which again I think to the discredit of what happened to Timothy Dalton, kind of had this idea of like kind of the comically evil Bond villain, very much is from his era with like the side characters like Jaws. That it's, you know, for those who don't know, Jaws is like this henchman that everybody seems to hire that wants to stop James Bond, that just has this huge like metal teeth apparatus in his mouth and he bites things. And it's just he's comically evil and just kind of like just so he's just so funny that it kind of like diminished some of the things that had been built up. And so he definitely is the fun Bond. But I will say that one thing that was really cool that he did bring, and one of the reasons why I probably don't rate him lower than I do, is that he brought skiing. He was like, he did ski stunts himself actually, and he did. There's a lot of skiing in Roger Moore movies because he was quite a good skier, and he was able to bring something new and kind of fun to some of the action sequences, which was pretty cool. He also has this weird place in like, I mean, we didn't really talk about it, but you know, at some point people will probably talk about it. The whole idea of like the misogyny of James Bond. He has a weird place in it because he's probably simultaneously the least using and most using of women because um, you know, Roger Moore seduces every single woman he ever comes across, sleeps with most of them, but a lot of them it's just kind of pointless other than to say, oh, look at that Bond seducing another woman. Whereas most of the other guys, most of the other Bonds, it's like there is a point to it, and there's it's kind of, oh, look at James Bond using his charm to get information out of these people. You can make arguments whether which one is good, better or worse, and which one best represents James Bond. But I think that's one of my problems again with him portraying the character of James Bond as kind of like a secret agent that gets things done, is that he doesn't really seem like he is suave, and he is able to, like, he has the charisma of James Bond, but not kind of like the efficiency. And it does make some of the fight scenes he's in, especially as Ben the Movie Buff mentioned, I think in his later movies, a little funnier, because he's clearly not physically at his peak anymore, and he has to kind of rely on other things, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, he kind of stands out to me as like the Adam West Batman of the James Bonds. He's the one that is remembered for being in fun movies, and you kind of have to suspend your disbelief a bit to imagine him like living out the role throughout his entirety of his like tenure as the character. Having not seen all his movies, I can't speak for that, but just what I've heard you guys say and what I've heard others say, it sounds like that's kind of the mold he fits into.
Average Joe, it's so funny that you brought that up because having seen all of Roger Moore's movies, yes, I think that is actually the perfect way to describe what kind of Bond he is. He's still a pretty cool Bond, and I'm sure he did the best he could. But yes, I think he is kind of the Adam West Bond.
And now coming into third place, we're halfway through the list, and the points drop down significantly. Roger Moore had 20 points, and our third place person has 14. Seems pretty unanimous among the sources we've used that the actors who were in the bottom three or top three, however you think about it, were where they're meant to be, and then these three are the ones that are closer together. So in third place, with 14 points, we have Daniel Craig, who has been in 4 Bond movies to date, and his 5th film, No Time to Die, is coming out supposedly in 2021.
Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
The 007 website says Daniel Craig brought the danger, seductive rawness, and realism to Bond that the 2006 reboot of the series demanded. Born in England, and I won't say his birth year, Craig worked in television with some of the world's leading directors. While taking cues from every one of the previous Bond actors, Craig has redefined James Bond for the 21st century, exploring new depths in the character, and met the challenges of filmmaking with a commitment to performing many of his own stunts.
So I'm gonna go out and say it. I don't like him at all. He is my last Bond on my list, and it's not so much for disliking the movies, although I think Quantum of Solace, if Runeraker is the worst James Bond movie, Quantum of Solace is the most forgettable James Bond movie, in my opinion. But I think what I've rewatched some of the movies, and I don't hate him as much as I did at first sight, but I still kind of dislike his portrayal because I think that's not really accurate, that he brought something new. Like the timeline and the time in which he is, and the way that, spying has evolved, and that he has to represent that in the 21st century, definitely has modified our expectations for James Bond. But I don't think he actually brought anything new to the character that hadn't been there under like that Pierce Brosnan hadn't done, or that Sean Connery hadn't done. Like he definitely brought a little bit more grit and realism, but I often feel like it wasn't necessarily him as an actor so much as the movies he was in that are the reason why the reboot of James Bond was so successful. That could just be me, but and again, I don't know. I am a very big fan of the older James Bond movies, and I kind of disliked how action movie and not as much spy movies his movies were. So I don't know. My bias kind of goes two ways, but also when I think of, like, again, if Timothy Dalton is the one I think resembles the most what I think of Bond, Daniel Craig is the one who resembles it the least. In the sense that I don't know. I always use this, and I know other people have used it before, but like the mirror of the bathing suit scene that's in Casino Royale when he comes out of the water and he has massive pecs and no abs, and that just boggled my mind, because if you were actually doing the kind of things he would do, you would have better arms and abs, and that's a nitpick I know that I have, but I just found that he was kind of too soft at times, and almost too incompetent at times for them to actually forgive everything that he did, especially if you look at kind of the redemption arc he has in Skyfall and in the other one whose name I can't remember, but like he kind of has like this redemption, or he was washed up and is coming back. It's something that Pierce Brosnan had already done, but they had reasonable reason to accept him back. I'm thinking specifically of Die Another Day. It's in that movie there is kind of he's abandoned, he comes back, he's shunned, and it's done in a much better way, I think, thematically and more kind of closed in that movie than it was. And so, like, I'm not saying that Casino Royale or the movies he was in were bad, but I felt like they felt a little tired to me and a little less like James Bond movies, and he feels a little bit less like James Bond than the other.
So that was really interesting to hear because I, for one, absolutely love Daniel Craig. I think I agree with the quote that Average Joe mentioned earlier, and I would argue, and I mean, I'm going off of Casino Royale here because, like I said earlier, it's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I think, in my opinion, the best Bond movie that I've ever seen. But what I really like about his performance in that movie, the two things that I see in that movie that I don't recall seeing in any other Bond movies, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong if you think of another instance of this, but I love how in Casino Royale, I think a lot of us can agree that the best action scene in that movie is the parkour chase that happens in the first 20, 30 minutes of the movie. And obviously, one could argue that, oh, half the time we see Daniel Craig in this chase, the other half, it's just stuntmen from wide shots. But be that as it may, I think he does a great job in the closer shots, selling that he is agile, that he is physical, that he can clearly hold up against his own and fight bad guys. I think he does such a great job in that scene, even if half of his shots are of stuntmen. So I love what he does there. I also love later on. There's a scene without going into too much spoiler zone. Um, something something really horrific for Eva Green's character, for Vesper's character, has happened. Something that she's never seen before. And there's a scene where Daniel Craig kind of comes back to his hotel room and he sees her. She's still in her dress, but she's in the shower and the shower's running. And she says, I feel like I can't get the blood off of my hands. Right. So he kind of sits down there and is soft and tender and kind of just is there to try and care for her. And I remember reading an interesting fact where they said initially she was going to do the scene in her underwear, which, of course, when you do that, I feel like you kind of make the scene a bit more sensual. And of course, that seems just right at home because a lot of Bond movies, he's using his charm and having intimate relationships with all these women. But I like how at this point they left it as it is, that she's just in her dress. She's kind of dealing with this trauma of what happened, and he's there to care for her. So yeah, I think he's a great Bond, and yeah, Quantum of Solace is not a great movie. Spectre is also like decent at best, but he's good in Skyfall, and Casino Royale for me is just one of the best movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about if they're even playing the same character or not, because at least with Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, the idea is that it's like a prequel, or it's meant to be a prequel to every other James Bond movie, because this is like the story of like how he got his license to kill, and the missions he went on immediately after getting that, and the experiences he has in those movies kind of form him into the person that we see in the other James Bond movies. So in a way, it's like he's not playing the same character. He's not as polished. He's not as suave. He doesn't have as much of the charm because he's still trying to figure that out. And so you could argue it's like, should we even include him in this list? Because he's in essence, not really playing the same character. He's playing like the person becoming James Bond, at least initially. The later movies, he's kind of like more sliding into the role. And you talk about these Bond actors being like from their time period. His set of movies came out after movies like The Bourne Identity, which kind of, as the way I see it, reinvented what the spy movie was meant to be in the early 2000s. Kind of like it showed the influence of like how virtual technology and computers really impact the whole spy industry, and how the kind of like the action became more like visceral and like close up and more intense, and the spy movies started to become more of like a thriller in a way than previously. So the Daniel Craig Bond movies kind of slip into the, okay, this is the 21st century now. This is what we expect a spy movie to be. So he kind of has that going you could say maybe against him as well. This is the only Bond where I've seen most of his movies, so I certainly have positive associations with the character, with the Daniel Craig version of the character. And yeah, Casino Royale I think is probably my favorite Bond movie. But that shouldn't, like, this is not a ranking of the Bond movies; it's the actors who've played the part. And so, you look at the guy. I think he's the shortest of the Bonds, which says something that, like, I understand the book character is supposed to be very tall and Daniel Craig's very short, but he kind of like reminds me of like Christian Bale or Ben Affleck in the Batman rankings, because I can believe that Daniel Craig has the physicality to do all the things that Bond does. Like, I kind of buy him as that character insofar as that I can imagine him actually doing the things that Bond does.
The last thing then of which I think to me it's not necessarily Daniel Craig's fault. And I should probably say that I have nothing against Daniel Craig as an actor. I think he's a tremendous actor. He's done really great other things. And like recently watched Knives Out, and that was amazing. But like, the thing is that what I have found is that in a lot of big, powerful moments, and I'm specifically thinking about kind of the climactic and emotional climax of Skyfall, he was taking a backseat. Specifically taking a backseat to M, and like I know it was Dame Judi Dench stepping away from the role, and it was very big, and she killed it. But I think that that's also something that you don't see in other James Bond movies. He is like James Bond is the star of those movies, bar none, just about. And so these movies are a snippet of their time, and to have a single male hero do all the work in a movie isn't something that really happens that much. And also to have a spy do all the work completely alone without his team also doesn't really work these days in a spy movie, and I understand that. But it feels like so much of a departure from the character, even more so than it was with Timothy Dalton or with Pierce Brosnan, that it's hard to reconcile with the rest of it. And I'll be honest, if like you guys, Casino Royale had been one of my earlier exposure to James Bond, it probably would have changed my mind, and I probably would ranking him a little bit higher. But as it is now, I find that it's hard for me to reconcile putting him above, well, pretty much anybody for the issues I have with the movies. Well, not with the movies exactly, but like as his portrayal of Bond. Like, I don't dislike the Daniel Craig movies, and I do think that yeah, Casino Royale and Skyfall are amazing movies, among some of the best James Bond movies. But his portrayal of James Bond, I feel in some cases kind of downplay it, because if I think of Casino Royale, I think of like some of the side characters as having given a better performance than him.
And now we go to the final two. In second place with 10 points, Pierce Brosnan, who starred as James Bond in 4 movies.
Thank you, Mr.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
The website says Pierce Brosnan's performance as 007 captured the timeless appeal of the character in a new world of high technology and post-Cold War intrigue. Born in Ireland, Brosnan carved out a distinguished career as an artist and circus fire eater before starring in Tennessee Williams' The Red Devil's Battery Sign in London. Brosnan was considered for the part of Bond in 1986, but his TV commitments to Remington Steele meant that he didn't don 007's tuxedo until 1995. Now, this was certainly the Bond actor that, again, I would have been first exposed to, because his movies came out when I was growing up. And whenever I saw like clips of him or like watched one of the movies, I'm like, yeah, this guy feels like James Bond. I actually looked it up. Apparently, he has like signed into his contracts that he's not allowed to appear in a movie wearing a tuxedo unless it's a James Bond movie, because apparently he's like so iconically Bond in a tuxedo that no other movie is allowed to have him wearing a tuxedo.
If I remember correctly, even though I went in chronological order as much as I could with the Bond movies after I saw Casino Royale, I think the second Bond movie that I would have seen would have been GoldenEye, which means that the second time I watched a Bond movie and saw someone else as the character, it would have been Pierce Brosnan. And I haven't seen that many other movies with Pierce Brosnan besides the Bond movies, but I find in general, like he has a knack for acting cool. You know, it looks so effortless the way he talks to people, the way he plays poker, the way he says the famous James Bond line. I think he does a great job of just really living up to what Sir Ian Fleming had in mind for the character.
Yeah, I think he is my personal favorite Bond. I placed him first on my list for mostly the reasons that Ben kind of went through, and but also for the fact that his character did have a certain amount of character growth, and I actually like I know pardon me, he wasn't in that many movies, but I know the order in which his movies were because there is enough of a character arc for him throughout all of them that you can kind of follow the development without him becoming a new character. He does kind of slightly change from movie to movie, and I find that that's something that was really good about him. Yeah, his physical presence, his kind of persona was really good as well, and I think honestly, that's the thing that I think most people will agree characterizes the top two for this list is that they just are so iconically attached to the role and to what people think of the role. Because even though, Roger Moore was the longest lasting James Bond, it almost might have even been to his detriment that he lasted so long because there were so many like small things that came to tarnish what he was as James Bond, being a clown outfit and so on. Whereas uh, this was, just yeah, so effortless and so simply cool that he was. And also, kind of coming back to what I was saying about Timothy Dalton, by the time GoldenEye came out, the scene and the stage was set for that kind of a Bond to come out, because I do think that Timothy Dalton's Bond is very close to his in a lot of ways, but the time was right. And frankly, GoldenEye to this day is my favorite James Bond movie. I think it's excellent on so many levels, and he was just um, such a powerful presence, but also without kind of like taking over the movies completely. Like there were still good performances, but it is still the James Bond show for him, even though like the villains and the new M having Dame Judi Dench come in the role worked out with him, and I really wish they would have kept John Cleese as Q, but not everything is perfect.
Yeah, on a side note, the opening scene before the GoldenEye theme song in GoldenEye is just, yeah, it's incredible. And I'm still like picturing various moments and like the certain stunts that we see, the certain situations of suspense and tension. It's so great. I think Pierce Brosnan is so good in the role that, as we hear sometimes, when someone is in such a popular role, that we have a hard time seeing them as anything else. So Pierce Brosnan was in Mrs. Doubtfire a few years before being in GoldenEye. But anytime I rewatch Mrs. Doubtfire, I'm just like, man, I still see James Bond. Or even he has a supporting role in The Foreigner with Jackie Chan. And even though, of course, in that movie, Jackie Chan does all the cool, impressive physical stuff, Pierce Brosnan is still so cool in that movie, and I just think I'm like, maybe he's like an aged James Bond or something like that. He has so cemented himself in the role, and that's how good he is.
From what I've been told, I haven't seen all of his movies, but I've been told is that his movies got progressively worse and kind of more silly as they went along. So I guess maybe for some people that kind of like affects their ranking of him as a Bond actor, is that he kind of started in a place very similarly to Timothy Dalton in terms of approach to the character, but then you get to Die Another Day and there's invisible cars. I guess that kind of explains why maybe he's not the number one Bond actor for everybody. And that's a good place to bring us home to number one with 9 points. So you keep in mind, Pierce Brosnan had 10 points, and the guy who won has 9 points. So it's a very close race. There's clearly a lot to go off of here. It's not just a clear, obvious winner, but the Batjar system is showing that indeed the number one James Bond actor is Sean Connery, who has starred in 6 official Bond movies.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
The official website says Sean Connery was the first actor to bring Ian Fleming's James Bond to the movie screen. Born in a working class neighborhood of Edinburgh, Scotland, Connery joined the Navy at an early age and afterwards worked as a bricklayer, lifeguard, and French polisher. In his spare time, he enjoyed bodybuilding. This hobby led to modeling and small theatrical parts that included training with Swedish dancer Jat Malmgren. These experiences instilled in him the masculine grace and air of confidence that producers Albert R. Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were looking for in their 007. So yeah, the guy who originated the part shows up at number 1 on the list. Often with these kind of legacy characters that show up through several film franchises, it goes either way. It could be that the first person did it so iconically that no one who came after was able to top them. Or again, to bring it back to Batman, it's like the first actor to play them on screen kind of just did a thing and other people improved upon it later. So it seems based on what we're talking about that Sean Connery, despite being the first actor to play the part, still shows up.
I mean, when we were talking about being iconic for Pierce Brosnan, like it's nothing compared to Sean Connery. I did the bit at the beginning, Bond, James Bond. He is synonymous with the character, like possibly even more than Pierce Brosnan. I mean, to the extent that you were talking about Ben the movie buff was talking about like seeing Pierce Brosnan in other movies. I'm not even going to attempt to restart that one. Made him think that it's an older James Bond, but I mean there is the movie The Rock with Nicolas Cage. For those who haven't watched it, hilarious movie, but also good action and a good movie. But like there's this general theory that he is in fact James Bond just under another name because he's like this older secret agent, like British secret agent that's like being brought in to help with a case. And so I think that, probably it wasn't intended at all. But then people were like, yeah, no, clearly it's Sean Connery. It has to be James Bond, right? And, but I think it isn't, like, I don't think it is strictly just nostalgia. I do honestly think that he has a very good portrayal of James Bond. And yes, rewatching some of his first movies and you're looking at it is like a little bit cringy, but then comparing them to other movies in the 60s, you realize that, oh, this was something new, this was something big, and there was something to his performance that everybody in like every other Bond in some way more or less tried to emulate things that he did. And I think that yes, he did have the advantage of doing it first, but I don't think it takes away from his portrayal of the character. And again, like Timothy Dalton and like Pierce Brosnan and like even Daniel Craig, people look at the portrayal as him being kind of a ruthless and getting stuff done and being able to actually perform the action and finish the mission and prioritizing that over other people. I think is something that definitely was a very strong part of his character. And even just having him giving up on certain other pursuits because Queen and Country needed it, but without having to say it explicitly, which some of the other James Bond movies, it's like, oh, look at you working for Queen and Country. I'm thinking a lot about Janos and Goldeneye, but like there was that understanding in Sean Connery in the way like especially if you look in the first few movies where he kind of has a relationship back in England and the way he treats his girlfriend in relation to his job, there is a clear priority to him that is kind of portrayed rather than being explicitly said, which I think is very strong characterization. He is James Bond without having to try to be.
Yeah, I agree. I think with George Lazenby, with basically any actor who played Bond after Sean Connery, in a way, like they kind of had it, they had it easy and they also had it difficult, right? They had it easy because they already got to see someone play the character to get a sense of, well, here's how someone did it. And yeah, you could basically take the things that you liked about that first performer and then, of course, make it your own, change it up a bit, try and take it in a new direction. But I feel like, yeah, Sean Connery did kind of have it difficult because he was the first person to play Bond in a theatrical live action version of the movie. And I think, yeah, he nailed it. And I do agree with what Beeper said earlier about how when I look at Pierce Brosnan, I think, yeah, man, I can't see him as anyone else but Bond. But yeah, Sean Connery, like he takes that. If Pierce Brosnan is a 10, then Sean Connery is an 11. And I think like he has the look. He's great at delivering his lines. That Scottish accent, which I won't even dare try and imitate, is just so cool. He's tall. He's good looking. And yeah, I had a pretty good idea 15, 20 minutes ago who number one was going to be, and it's not a huge surprise. He's a great Bond.
I just remembered my quick internet search when I made the joke about the tallest Bond being the best one. It actually does hold true. Sean Connery apparently was the tallest actor to play James Bond, which I was really surprised. I thought it was Timothy Dalton because he's kind of tall and lanky, whereas Sean Connery um, doesn't seem to be that tall because he's got more of a stocky build. But I think that might have also been something to benefit. Like I talked about a few actors, but he does have the physicality to be kind of a more imposing figure, and I think that does go a long way. And it was also, a thing that George Lazenby and Roger Moore kind of didn't have as much. Like they were gentlemanly and they were very good looking, but they weren't necessarily as imposing. And that's something that Sean Connery had and kind of introduced into the character from the beginning. It's that you don't mess around with James Bond.
Yeah, I'm looking at like photos of Sean Connery from his Bond movies, and there's just something about his face. Like he has this like intense look about him, and it says, "Don't mess with me." And then, like that's just the way he was born. He was born that way. He didn't have to really act a different way to do that. But it just says something about how he embodies the role physically, and the fact that he's speaking in a Scottish accent, even though the character is supposed to be British. It seems to work. Like he's able to nail it. He's able to nail the cadence, the delivery, in a way that everyone's like, that is 007. Like I don't care if he doesn't have the precise accent that the character should have.
And I have no problem in saying this, but if I had to pick um, the actor, because I mean, all the actors that have played Bond, I think are good looking. But if I had to pick the one that was the most attractive, I'd say it was Sean Connery, hands down, and maybe like Pierce Brosnan would be in second place.
The last thing I think, which might be kind of telling, I'd have to double check with the other one, but I think Sean Connery, from listening to Average Joe's definition, was the only one who was actually, had military background. He was in the Navy, and canonically, James Bond was in the Navy before he joined the Secret Service, and I think that does work into it.
So quick check, Roger Moore had also been in the military, but it doesn't say where he was in the military. So
Okay. I think it does make a difference in some ways to kind of know what you're doing in that kind of a role.
So there you have it, the official Batjar ranking of the James Bond actors. Sean Connery is number one.
My name is Bond.
Bond.
It's Bond.
Bond.
It's Bond.
It's Bond.
James Bond.
Let us know what you think. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Let us know. Send us an email. Message us on Twitter, because once again, we have no mail. And you guys are assumingly still quarantined at home, so you got lots of time to send us emails.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
message us on Facebook or message us on Twitter at.
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast in whatever platform you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Please give us a rating, write reviews for our shows, and share our posts on social media. This will help us to bring all people inside the Bat Jar.
So now it's time to go into the Bat Jar and find out what we're going to talk about next week. I really miss being in person with you guys, because I hate being the one actually pulling things out of the jar. And since I have the Bat Jar with me, it means that I got to be the one to do it. Oh no, it's finally happened.
Is it more One Piece?
No, but it's a topic that I knew it was in here, and I was dreading it, hoping that it would never come up. Next week we're talking about Lord of the Rings.
Yes!
So it's no secret, I'm not a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. I don't necessarily hate it. I acknowledge that it's a very worthwhile thing to talk about or to read or to watch. I'm just not a huge fan. I know, Ben, the movie buff, you've actually dressed up as Lord of the Rings characters before, so I'm sure you're a fan.
Yes, I am. a Hobbit through and through. And yeah, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's no better trilogy. They are among my favorite movies of all time. Return of the King is my all-time favorite movie of all time. And yeah, I'm. This is going to be pretty awesome. I was born for this.
No matter how you feel about it, there's a reason Return of the King swept the Oscars.
And this will be interesting. We'll probably have some other special guests. Shaggy Neo, who was here a few weeks ago, claims to be a giant Lord of the Rings fan. A couple of the people in my life have claimed to be huge Lord of the Rings fans. So it should be a party next week. So everyone, you got nothing to do at home, read Lord of the Rings this week or watch all the extended editions of the movies. So we're going to be talking about the Lord of the Rings franchise next week. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
Ribs. Beef pork ribs.
I'm Ben, the movie buff.
Catch you on the flip side.
See you later.
See you in the next one.